Hi, everybody. Bill Prince again. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking with you about employment relationships and some of the issues that can arise in that area. In working in business or running a business, be it in the public or private sector, HR relationships and HR issues can be some of the most challenging, the most stressful. Those are the ones that you seem to take home from work with you a lot. I know that in managing an organization with around 100 employees, it seems like any time that you have two or more people together, there is always the potential for some sort of employment disagreement arising, and it's the job of managers to have to one, hopefully prevent them from happening to begin with, which again never happens, but two, dealing with them in a relatively expeditious, fair, and legal way. We spent a lot of time in chapter 21 talking about kind of the nuts and bolts of the employee-employee relationship through agency and things of that nature, but wanted to spend some time talking about some of the legal issues that stem from that relationship as well in this chapter. And, in most states, Missouri is one, we operate under this thing called employment at will, which has a really simple general rule, but there are so many exceptions that those exceptions almost render the general rule worthless. And, of course, the general rule in regards to employment at will is that, absent an employment agreement, basically, an employment contract, an employer can terminate an employee, or an employee can quit his or her employment at any time for any reason, or for no reason at all, without recourse. And again, so that's the idea of, hey, things just aren't working out, see you later. But we all know that in the litigious times in which we live, that just doesn't play out in reality. And so there have been a number of exceptions that have sort of been created by courts and legislatures that really have basically gutted that general rule. And those exceptions include things like, is there an implied employment contract? So even if there is no written contract, sometimes courts can, through looking at the conduct of the parties, imply a contractual limit or termination. So again, if there's something in an employment manual or policy and personnel manual or policy and procedures that seem to create some length of term, courts have been willing to say, well, nope, you can't terminate them before that term is up, unless you pay them compensation and things of that nature. Some states apply what's called a duty of good faith, which means that you can't just terminate them for any reason because you don't like somebody or because you don't like what they're wearing to work or things of that nature. But there has to be, quote unquote, a reason for doing it. If there's an abusive discharge, so you tell the person they're fired, you do it in front of everybody in the office. You take their belongings and you throw them out, in the front of the building. Those kinds of things where you act in sort of this abusive or emotionally abusive way, that can create a cause of action in favor of the employee against the employer. Public policy. If many states prohibit terminating an employee for refusing to act illegally or unethically, or for refusing to act contrary to fundamental public policy. So, if you instruct an employee to cut corners or cook the books or something like that, and they refuse to do that, and then you just say, hey, we're firing you because you're an employee at will. If they can come back and show that, well, the real reason that you're doing it is because I refuse to violate the law or violate an ethical obligation, that can create liability as well. And that sort of follows into this whistleblower status where, again, not only is it against state law, but federal law too, to prevent or to fire somebody who has basically turned in the employer for engaging in illegal conduct. An employee who is terminated in violation of law, public policy, or the terms of an employment contract can sue the employer for wrongful discharge. And let me mention one other thing. if that employee is a member of a protected class, which we'll talk about a little later, but an age issue, a race issue, a gender issue, a pregnancy issue, a religious issue, those are all sort of red flags that you have to be careful about. So the bottom line, at least in places I've worked and in dealing with HR departments that I deal with, you need to document. You need to document, and really, the days of getting rid of people for no cause is sort of gone, and you really have to have a pretty good record of bad behavior or poor performance to support discharging somebody. There's also a number of wage and hour laws, that exist that govern how we pay people, and one of the major ones is the Fair Labor Standards Act, and it's a federal law that applies to employees of all employers engaged in interstate commerce, which again is a lot of us, and again, you use a phone across state lines, you send a fax across state lines, you potentially are engaging in interstate commerce, and it deals with things such as child labor laws, which it prevents kiddos under the age of 14 from most kinds of work. Again, there are some exceptions, for the paper boy or working at the putt-putt course or things of that nature, but again, it was designed to sort of get rid of the old days where we had 12-year-olds working in factories and things of that nature. It also provides for the minimum wage, which ensures that employers are paying a set wage. It may not be a living wage, but it is a minimum wage. And again, a lot of it deals with overtime laws as well, and dealing with exempt employees and non-exempt employees. And there are certain categories of employees, supervisors you think about, who can work 80 hours a week, and then they're not entitled to additional compensation. And then there's what we call sort of a non-exempt employees who are not exempt from the overtime laws, and again, if they work a minute over, you have to pay them time and a half and things of that nature. So we do have wage and hour laws that attempt to protect workers. Again, these kind of come and go with administrations, and some presidential administrations and governments tend to be much more labor friendly than others have been historically. We will see about the new one and what its wage and hour stuff looks like. Another big thing that hasn't always existed, but has been with us for a while, is family and medical leave. And again, this recognizes this idea that life happens to people, and that we're not just simply these cogs in a machine, and that we have families. And again, the Family and Medical Leave Act requires that employers with 50 or more employees provide their employees with up to 12 weeks of medical or family leave during any 12-month period. So, if baby comes along, this allows people to take that much time up. Doesn't necessarily have to be compensated, but you have to keep the job open during that period of time. So as noted here, during the leave period, the employer must continue to provide benefits to the employee, but the employer is not required to pay the employee while on leave. So, once that employer or the employee was to exhaust sick or vacation time, if there was more of that 12 weeks left, while the job would have to be open, while the benefits would have to be continued, the pay would not necessarily have to be so. So, as noted here, the employer must also guarantee that the worker can return to his or her prior job or a comparable job, unless the employee is a key employee, and that's again somebody whose income is in the top 10% of the firm's workforce. FMLA does not apply to employees who have worked at the employer for less than a year, who have worked less than 25 hours a week for the previous year, or who are key employees whose pay falls within the top 10% of the employer's workforce. So if you're a key person, plan on working. Additionally, federal law and state law as well provides for worker health and safety. And again, we didn't always live in a country where working conditions were cared much about. And again, you just need to go back to the turn of the, not this last century, but the century before that, and start looking at the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And I'm sure have read about just the deplorable working conditions that existed. And it was through governmental change that we basically can go to work these days without worrying about getting killed every day. And so we have an organization in government called the Occupational Health. Sorry, I can't talk today. Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That's called OSHA, and that's a federal agency empowered to promulgate workplace safety standards, conduct inspections, and do investigations when there's been injuries or complaints. Interestingly, and I never will understand this, but and this isn't a politics class, but elections matter, and a lot of people view regulations like those imposed by OSHA, as quote unquote anti-competitive. That they make us less competitive with, factories and places where they don't have these regulations. But I would just say this: that fortunately, in this country, you don't read about factory or warehouse fires, killing hundreds of employees like you do overseas, where there are no safety standards. And so I just always I think sure, it would probably be cheaper to manufacture something here, but what is the cost of a human life worth? And so I'm always a little reluctant when people want to roll back these kinds of regulations. So you can read a little bit more about that, and then of course we also have workers' compensation laws, which are state laws. That attempt to compensate workers who have been injured on the job, and so that's a good thing as well. What about this electronic monitoring of employee communications? We have a thing called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which prohibits intentionally intercepting any wire or electronic communications and intentionally disclosing or using any information so intercepted. So, what about employees at a business who are provided employer-provided cell phones, iPads, laptops, desktop computers, and things of that nature? What rights do our employers have to monitor our communications on those? And I would argue they have the absolute right to do that. And I think anybody who uses employer-provided electronic equipment and doesn't think that their communications and so forth might be monitored are naive. So I think you just have to assume that if you're dealing with employer-provided electronic stuff, that your emails that you send, your phone conversations that you have, potentially could be monitored. And so here, as noted, there's a business exception to that, and that exception is that employers can monitor their employees' electronic communications. One, if the employee consents to interception by the employer. Now, I can just tell you that I'm not sure that consent is not is all that important, but I know in our electronic policy. That we have at our office, when folks are provided with the iPads or the laptops, they sign an agreement that they understand that this could happen. Or again, if lacking that consent, the communication was sent or received via a device that was furnished by the employer, and that the employee is using in the ordinary course of the employer's business. So, just assume that if you're if you're online all day at the office looking at Facebook and Pinterest and things of that nature, that your employer can take a peek at that and potentially use that against you in employment reviews and things of that nature. Okay. Other privacy acts. What about drug testing and lie detector tests and things of that nature? Well, there is a thing called the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, which prevents employers from requiring or causing employees or applicants to take a lie detector test, or using or accepting or referring to the results of any lie detector test taken by an applicant, and taking or threatening any negative employment action based on an employee's applicant lie detector test results and his or her refusal to take a lie detector. So, sometimes there are certain jobs that have high security clearance where, you're going to be required to have to take a pre-employment polygraph. Sometimes your employment agreement, if you're dealing with sensitive information or things of that nature, may you basically agree that you will submit to polygraph tests. But by and large, most of us who work cannot be just randomly told we got to get hooked up to this machine and spill our guts, and that's because of the Employee Polygraph Protection Act that happens. In terms of drug testing, and I think probably most of us have been subject to drug testing at one time or another. Pre-employment drug screens are pretty easy. Post-employment drug screens are a little more problematic. But again, if done in a random way, where it doesn't seem like you were being targeted, then you can be asked to take drug tests periodically during your employment. In terms of AIDS and HIV testing, and this used to be a bigger issue than it is now. The ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, and things like that, has said that somebody who has HIV or AIDS, cannot be necessarily discriminated against in employment, and they have to, reasonable accommodation has to be made for those folks. And here's the new one. This genetic testing. Just reading about this, the other day. Can your employer, when you come to work, swab, take a swab, and find out do you have a genetic predisposition to certain diseases or injuries or things like that, and can they use that information not to hire you to begin with, or to not provide you with health insurance and things of that nature. And so, as science becomes more sophisticated, some of the ethical and moral issues that these things create, to you and I as just regular people in the workforce can be pretty tricky. So stay tuned on that. More to come. So anyway, those are just some brief issues in dealing with the employer-employee relationship, and we'll visit with you again in a little bit. Take care.